Good afternoon. I'm John Walsh, and I'm here to introduce the speaker this afternoon. It's a real privilege for me and really a joy to introduce Nicola Zutor to this audience at the gallery. During the past year, some of you regular gallery visitors will have noticed her in the galleries with groups of her students, looking closely and having lively conversations. She is a prize acquisition of the History of Art department. She came last year from the Freie Universität in Berlin, from which she got her doctoral degree in 2001, and where she'd been teaching since 2012. Before that, she'd taught at Stanford, and then at the universities of Bern, Heidelberg, Hamburg, and had an interlude at Princeton as a member of the Institute for Advanced Study. The subjects of the course she's already given, or is giving at Yale, suggest her interests. Art and the Enlightenment, Baroque Rome, Rembrandt, and my favorite, a seminar that, last fall that she called Looking, Describing, and Interpreting. Her writing has gained her a lot of attention and admiration from the field. She's edited 5 collections of essays and contributed to them. And more important, she's published 3 books, all related. One on Titian, the subject of Titian, visual pleasure, and the idea of sensual painting. The next called Bravura, on virtuosity and willfulness in painting. And a third book called Rembrandt's Roughness, about the artist's technique and the ideas behind it. Much of her writing, or most of it, I think, has been in German so far, but the Rembrandt book is being published in an English translation soon, and it will be required reading around here and many other places too. Her work has dealt with how artists draw and paint and how their working processes shape the meaning of what they make. How art writing also in the 17th and 16th and 17th centuries, if you read it carefully and sympathetically, helps us understand the artist's intentions. So she strikes a kind of deft balance and timely balance between artistic practice and theory. So it's a great thing to have Nicola Zutor at Yale, both for the History of Art department and for the gallery and for her audiences here. The title of her lecture today is Rembrandt's 3 Crosses. Nicola Zutor.
Thank you so much, John, for this very kind introduction and for this very warm welcome here in general at Yale. With my talk, I want to invite you to take a closer look at one of Rembrandt's most amazing compositions, not only in regard to his graphic works, but also of his entire oeuvre. The 3 Crosses came down to us in 4 different states of print. These steps of the series render visible Rembrandt's creative mind. The artist took up the copperplate 3 times, successively clarifying some passages, adding detail, and elaborating the plasticity of the figures. In this detail, showing the 2 central figures of the foreground, you can see how a field, you can see how a field that in the earlier state only consists of cross-hatching, evoking a shadow area, is finally incorporated into the figure's billowing garment by means of a contour line. In this detail, showing a group of 3 people occupying the foreground on the left side of the sheet, we see how heavily Rembrandt had reworked the figure, wearing a cocked hat. Interestingly, this reworking had an opposite effect. The composition is less clear. The raised hand seems now to be cut off from the very dark coat and may belong to the figure in the middle. This figure. What makes the 3 Crosses so unique is the 4th and final state, which appears more like an erasure than an improvement of the image he has so intensively worked on. We will consider this last and indeed troubling version towards the end of the talk. Interestingly, what persists throughout the reworking process is the overall impression of sketchiness. But this quality is a characteristic feature of Rembrandt's graphic technique in general. Arnold Haubraken, a student of one of Rembrandt's students, saw this feature critically. It is to be regretted, Haubraken insists, that Rembrandt was so inclined to alterations or easily diverted to another matter and has even more frequently only half finished his etching, so that what has been executed can only give us an idea of all the beautiful things that we would have of his if he had finished everything he had begun. What has been executed can only give us an idea. This is an interesting formulation because it suggests that the image is only insinuated and thereby stimulates the beholder's imagination. In pre-modern art theory, the sketch is often defined as first idea, and this is linked more to the image the artist has in mind than to its realization. Among Rembrandt's graphic works and paintings, the impression of sketchiness is probably most striking in the Three Crosses. Rembrandt created this work on copperplate using dry point alone, and it is assumed without preliminary drawings. As Christopher White has pointed out, Rembrandt's rendering of the Three Crosses itself reflects the coarse technique of sketching with a reed pen developed by the artist during that period. I show you the mockery of Christ in the Morgan Library in New York. Rembrandt was evidently interested in the particular rough appearance of figures conceived in such a fashion, although, interestingly enough, the reed pen and dry pen techniques themselves differ significantly, insofar as the line of the reed pen is fluent and its ink flow to a certain degree volatile, whereas in its necessary resoluteness, the dry point line reveals the master's touch. The intentional appearance of incompleteness is in harmony with this technique's basic feature. Working in dry point demands a special amount of strength, in contrast to etching, where the acid bath in which the copper plate is laid, in a sense, fleshes out the lines through cauterization. Here, the breadth and blackness of the line is based only on the pressure exerted by the artist's hand in guiding his instrument, the needle. The scratches on the copper plate produce an aesthetically intriguing side effect, the blur thrown up at the edge of the incised line. The physical pressure is manifest in the line's hardening edge, emerging clearly in those areas of the Three Crosses that have been left in sketch-like form. These areas in which the whiteness of the paper unfurls its specific luminosity are emotionally the most captivating. Rembrandt's experimental approach to chiaroscuro encompasses both the paper and its paint. As for the former, Rembrandt's deployed various, sometimes very precious papers, including Japan paper and vellum, which, due to their varying fiber structure, absorbed the wet paint in different ways. You see a print on vellum, a very costly kind of parchment. The skin-based semi-translucent sheet is warmer and slightly darker in tone. Its sleek surface doesn't absorb the ink as quick as paper does, and therefore the line becomes significantly broader. And because of the increase of its blurriness, the velvet quality of the dry point etching is enhanced. Regarding the paint, Rembrandt's experimental approach is discernible in the calculated, sometimes extensive smearing on the paper. The effect was produced by a deliberately incomplete whipping away of the paint from the smooth surface of the copper plate. We can make out, for instance, a most subtle smearing in the upper body of the thief of the right side on the right side. So you see that the white at is his legs is whiter, so more luminosity, has more light than his upper body. A heavy inking and smearing obscures the group in the left foreground. It may be the case that Rembrandt's unconventional technique resulted from a haphazard episode in a rather disorderly practice, but if so, it offered the artist an opportunity to recognize the extraordinary potential contained in the blemishes and develop them into an artistic agent. The careful exploitation of smudging on the plate, which works together with each distinct type of paper to produce a plate tone particular to each individual sheet, makes it unmistakably clear to the viewer that every single print of the three crosses is a unique original. The following analysis is a consideration of Christopher White's insightful observation that, I cite, the different inking of the plate gives a varying emotional impact. Technique and style are harmoniously blended into one of Rembrandt's most moving works in any medium. The Three Crosses presents us with a figuratively populous crucifixion scene. Rembrandt dramatizes his depiction of the traditional three-cross narrative by placing Jesus' cross not at the central vertical axis as usual, but a bit to the right. At the same distance from the outer edge of the print, on the opposite side of the sheet, we find the centurion fallen to his knees before the crucified Jesus. In this way, a tense interstitial space opens up at the picture's center. In looking at Jesus, we cannot fail to encounter this other person as well, our perception being expanded in the process. Our own view is channeled through his gaze towards Jesus. At the same time, due to the cross displacement, the picture's left side, with its soldiers and a crowd, takes on greater weight. This imbalance is visually rectified through the stronger illumination of the right side, consisting of the group of mourners around Mary. While Jesus' body is presented frontally, the crosses of the two thieves on his left and right are turned towards him. Corresponding to the extension of the left side, the thief hanging on the right is seen from an oblique angle, his counterpart on the left from a lateral angle. All through crucified bodies seem tender and fragile. With Jesus, the roughly outlined overlarge hands are startling, furnishing the figure with a massive quality. Where his right hand's fingers appear to be clenched around the crucifixion nail, in the case of the left hand, the clenching is undefined. Here, the outline of the more clearly evident nail and the fingers are hardly separable, since Rembrandt deployed straight lines, whose abstraction rendered the object of the conjuring unclear. Nail and clenched fingers are condensed pictorially. Jesus stands outstretched and upright, both feet on the supernanium. The contouring of his arms is clearly outlined. On his right side, long, straight, laid outlines, not corresponding to the contouring of Jesus' body, emphasize its outstretched nature, where the strokes, so you can see it here, these lines, where the strokes used for the left arm work at mimetically concretizing the shoulder and upper arm's muscles. A number of lines laid out in parallel here on the side of the legs contouring makes the artist's search in the course of form finding, the work in progress, evident in this area of the picture as well. Already in its earlier version, pentimenti apparently have been left visible. We thus see that Rembrandt's extended the loincloth on the right with the previous contouring of the upper side onset, previous contouring of the upper side onset is clearly visible. first thought here and then taken down. Jesus' head is elevated. The area of his eyes is shadowed by the broad crown of thorns, his eyelids seemingly shut. But his open mouth with deeply hanging corners is clearly visible. Rembrandt has dispensed with the contouring of the chin area, sketching in the beard area straight away with strong strokes. Curved lines playing around the contouring of his ribcage from behind represent extraordinary long hair. With both of the crucified thieves, the motive of spatial extended arms is absent. The hands of the thief on Jesus' right side are nailed to the upper side of the crossbeam so that his body seems to be more strongly sagging. The thief on the left side leans back with his shoulders up in the crossbeam, his arms falling behind his back, parallel to the main beam. His head is bent back into the nape of his neck, the extension marking his Adam's apple protrude sharply. Where the look at his counterpart, whose strongly blackened face is turned away from Jesus, appears rigid, it is as if the eyes of the left-hand thief are covered by a white blindfold, encompassing the back of his head as well, if we wish to understand the incisive stroke running through the eye and then far past his ear as the seam of such a band. His body is the only naked one in the picture. His wrists are tied to the cross. Two groups have assembled around the thief's cross, despairing mourners beneath the thief on Jesus' left. Across from them, a group of soldiers on horseback who press the thief on his right into the background. The mounted soldier closest to Jesus' cross, facing the viewer, presents himself as completely uninvolved emotionally. The indifference of all the soldiers beneath the cross here takes on a distinct face. The horseman on his right side is slightly turned towards him, as if casually passing on a word. The expression of indifference is intensified and encapsulated on the opposite side of the tighted gathered group of riders in the empty oval outlining the face of the retainer leading away a riderless horse, in all probability the horse belonging to the kneeling centurion. The apathetic expression of the horseman under the cross can be read as a sign of fatigue at watching over the death of the crucified men. Within the pictorial plan, his lens runs awkwardly into Jesus' contouring. I show you it in a minute. Contour at the height of the seam of his loincloth. The man's metal breastplate underscores his closed-off quality. It marks in marked distinction from this general impression is the emotional animation of the horse, which, rather oddly, seems to have fused with the rider because of an absent border between the two bodies. Despite the extreme sketchiness of a depiction that even incorporates the rider's saddle into the horse's back, we can still clearly see expanded nostrils, widened eyes, perked up ears, and open muzzle. The animal has turned its lifted head in the direction of the centurion, who is kneeling in front of the group of riders and praying to crucified Jesus with upraised hands. In constructing his figural composition, Rembrandt used an etching by the so-called Master B with a dice, active between 1532 to 1550. The centurion's avowal of faith is placed at the center of that work. Kneeling directly beneath the cross, he has laid his head back deeply to look up at Jesus, who is himself looking down upon him. His arms are extended strongly outward in a gesture of adoration, and he has removed his helmet and placed it before him at the foot of the cross. Next to his cross on the right, a standard bearer is high on his horse, his proud figure functioning as a foil that foregrounds the centurion's conversion's experience. On the left edge, but drawn close to the viewer, Mary prays inwardly, surrounded by three women who present three emotional expressions of mourning and despair. The woman seated lowest is huddled in resignation. The woman located behind her and at Maria's right side wrings her hand in despair. And the third woman has stretched her arms out beseechingly to the cross, looking up at Jesus. We can make out her expressively open mouth in the lost profile, this forming a counterpart to Mary and the two other women whose eyes are downcast. In the etching of Master B with the dice, the third woman's open hands and outstretched arms, together with her gaze upward at Jesus, associate her scenically with the central figure of the centurion. The surprising visual juxtaposition was taken up by Rembrandt, who intensified and redefined it. In the three crosses, we find the centurion's pendant in the female figure. She has turned her back towards us, has sunk to her knees, and holds her arms downward with open palms. Here. Her gesture is underscored with a shawl lying over her shoulder, whose forward-falling fringes can be clearly seen in the space between her arm and body. Where the centurion is immersed in a dramatic chiaroscuro, endowing his figure with forcefulness, this ancillary figure is simply roughly sketched in. Only the sleeves of her lower arms have been emphasized through parallel hatching. The clasp of her left sleeve is concretely visible, while the right sleeve is depicted in very summary form. We can observe, So here, I was too late with this. You can see her figure here and the sleeves here. The hatching moves onto the hand, the emphasis on the piece of cloth thus being brought together with the shadowing of her lower arm here. So this goes is one field of cross-hatching. We can observe a similar process at work at the centurion's back, where the parallel hatching produced the glow on the upper part of his shoulder area. One shoulder blade of his breastplate stands out clearly. On the left side, it enters completely into the entire back area's demarcation of shadow. Material differences are crossed out, the figure's plasticity diminished in order to bind it to the shadow. His lost profile is lost in undefined lines. The contour of his scabbard nearly disappeared optically in the hatching of the shadow zone. And it is this, the roughness of Rembrandt's lines, that reveals his artistic strategy, the medium of its formulation being chiaroscuro, clear, obscure. In Rembrandt's dry point etching, the female pendant to the centurion is not, as in the work of Master B with the dice, oriented towards the cross, but rather towards the mourner, serving, as it were, as corporal resonance. The outer right contour of her skirt opens up at just the place where the sketching of her figure borders to that of Mary's. Two parallel lines denoting the outward billowing of Mary's robe at the location of her right hip help delineate the prostrate position. Answering these lines is a decisively drawn vertical stroke, fixing the spatial position of the woman kneeling before Mary and keeping her at distance. Mary, supported by a helper from behind, has sunk backwards, although her head is inclined forward. Her headscarf is being drawn down over the forehead so that it casts a deep shadow area. Her eyes seem closed in pain. Rembrandt has looked back at Master B with the dice in his conception of Mary's figure as well. Consideration of Rembrandt's visual source helpers, understanding the intentional quality of the vague traces, the way the loose lines develop quickly into a plausible sketch. Speak now on, it's these 1, 2, 3 lines. Mary's corporal extension is indicated through 3 curved tired lines marking the stomach area, while a thin intersecting rising line underscores a lie sinking towards her supporter. So I'm here, this one. But it is difficult to make out the helping hand of the latter person. The supportive function is only suggested through coarse lines doubling the contour of Mary's right shoulder and resembling a pentimento, while recognizing the maiden's right hand in the connected fields of short straight lines demands a lot of fantasy. So this is here the double contouring that is, and here it seems there's the hand, maybe. It is more the shadowing of her form, of her figure, that endows Mary's sinking body with its weight and give it support. The close proximity between the 2 figures and the rough sketching, leading to a lack of clear separation between these 2 figures, produces an impression that Mary's left arm might also be attributed to her helper. So here. As a counterpart of the outline of both of Mary's knees, Rembrandt had sketched the idea of a lower thigh lightly sagging to the side, pressing through the rope with a single line, forming a thin arch. So here, the one indication, here's the other. Difficult to see from here. Rembrandt has also taken over Mary's praying stance, albeit seen from a side angle and pushed forward for the woman sitting before her with closed eyes. Here. An elevated area marking a light parallel hatching running beneath Mary on both sides create a kind of trench, spatially separating the 2 figures adjoining areas. An additional female figure appearing to lean against the sitting woman has turned away from the ongoing event, her mouth distorted in pain. She's sitting on the foot of a standing figure whose upper body is bent to the side, her face oriented to Jesus' cross. But the aim of the figure's gaze is hard to define in the foreshortening position of her seemingly bald head. The straight line running through her eyebrow may as well indicate the brim of a thin veil. So, here. These suggestions seem to become a bit more graspable in the straight parallel lines thickening her neck beneath her protruding ears, which, on the other hand, the ear cut across such a specification. So here it seems like there's cloth, but here it is kind of unclear. If we separate the parallel line connecting her hand from a seemingly arbitrary continuation above them, then we can make out a rosary she has placed around her index fingers. Although this detail would constitute an anachronism, it may circumscribe her role as a remote witness. Behind her and at the same level as the sitting woman before her, we see an additional face. It expands the group of mourners into an undefined quantity. Itself embodied, it would seem, in the draped figure here, seen in lost profile and thus obscure, set in chiaroscuro through parallel hatching. Behind Mary, as the central figure of mourning, the figure of John the Baptist rears up in pain, despairingly tearing at his hair. His mouth, with his full lips, pursued in sadness, formulate a silent lament, openly expressed in the open mouth of the old man behind him, while the deeply shadowed and inclined head of the woman alongside him displayed interiorized grief. Beneath her left shoulder, positioned before her, an additional mourner hides her face. The lament struck up by John has here become an expression of mute, resigned grief. And this muteness receives its visual incisiveness through the absence of any profiling of the face. At the same time, the withdrawal of the face should be understood as a self-critical statement on the expression of utmost grief. From Karel van Mander's Head Shoulder book, Rembrandt could have heard about a most praised ancient painting created by Timantus, showing the sacrifice of Iphigenia in the presence of her father, King Agamemnon, and other dignified people. After having depicted different expression of compassion in the faces of the bystander, reaching from sadness and despair to anger, Timantus couldn't imagine any further escalation of the expression of grief and decided, therefore, to show the father covering his face with a cloak and with it his ineffable inner pain. Interestingly, in the Three Crosses, the mourner is but an anonymous person, one of the humble people. Her facial indeterminateness and scenic insignificance resonates with a male figure holding the riderless horse on the opposite side, we have just noticed. His face as well presents a blank precision, calling on the beholder's imagination. The highly emotional expression of Mary and John are not challenged by these blank faces, which, because of being de facto unremarkable, stay in the background. They may visualize that the intended impact on the beholder is mimetically beyond reach, an inner affair, but clearly invoked by the open structure of the picture. The cloth in which the female figure's right hand seems inserted is so crudely sketched and so distinctly set off from the seam of the sleeve that it looks like a mitten. This figure, extremely brightened through the minimal drafting, forms the transition to those huddling on the ground. Clearly set off from the group of closely gathered standing mourners and visually overlapping with a female figure on her knees before Mary Magdalene, bows her head to the Suppedaneum. It is impossible to say whether the lines encircling her shoulder area and running down her back represent loose or so sparse hair, or rather are meant to evoke textile volume here. They are in any event entirely disconnected from the parallel hedging on the back of in the back of her head. Rembrandt has removed any charm from her figure. It appears as if Magdalena, in her humble bowing stance, wishes to collect the blood from the foot wounds of Jesus with a cloth. His left foot is in shadow so that her physical contact with it is obscured. The sketching of her forehead and his ankle are interlayered and collide. Beneath the cross and in the immediate foreground, two older bearded men in turbans and loose ornamental garb hurry away. While the man on our left has already stepped with dark countenance into the foreground's shadow area, his companion is still on the threshold, turned towards three women who have thrown themselves in the dust along the path he has just taken. His extended left hand shows he has taken notice. The pressing of his right arm into his body expresses, it seems, his reluctance to set upright the fear-filled and despairing woman. The woman closest to him, who appears to be clinched to his heels, occupies the interstitial space between the men. He has lifted her head slightly from the ground and is focusing her attention on the dog moving along behind the men, which appears to be barking at her. The woman placed in the middle, her face lying in the dust, holds a cane in her left hand. Her outstretched arm offers an impression of ardent pleading aimed at the two figures hurrying away. The face-by-face arrangement of the woman in the dust evokes an image of the blind leading the blind. If the diagonal traversing their bodies were oriented upward rather than downwards at the same angle, they would be on the ground before Jesus on the cross. The figural composition of these misled women somewhat resembles a group of foolish pilgrims as depicted in the famous woodcut of Michael Ostrendorfer, showing the pilgrimage to a miraculous image of the Virgin Mary located in a church in Regensburg. It is from 1520. Instead of entering the church to venerate the Vera Icon, the true image, several pilgrims have hastily thrown themselves on the ground in an act of misguided desperation in order to worship a mere sculpture of the Virgin Mary on top of a pillar. Some of their faces are immersed in the mud, some are lying in the foreground on their back as if stricken by the sight of the idol. Coming back to Rembrandt's Three Crosses, the theme of blindness is even more overtly present within the crowd of the left edge of the scene, located beneath the soldiers and turned away from the cross. An old woman holds her right hand over her face, while her male pendant, pressing himself into the rocks, even holds both hands over his eyes. A group of men whose central figure is foregrounded by the illumination of a face that reveals his grief, identified in historical literature as Simon of Cyrene, is striding with heavy steps towards the left side of the scene. The two men flanking him, turned towards him, are clothed in markedly different ways. While the man on his left recalls a merchant, the man on his right, holding a staff, is dressed in an oriental manner. But Rembrandt deliberately works against any closer definition of the figures by casting a strong shadow upon them, destining them to an obscurity compounded by drawing over their facial features in an unappealing manner. The parallel hatching places upon the man in contemporary garb, like a heavy cape, is so crude that with a close look it seems like an excision of a sketch lying beneath. This is the second and this is the third state. Between the man in oriental dress and the contemplative figure, presumably of Simon, Rembrandt has placed the bright emerging profile of a marginal figure gazing fixedly at the cross, the profile functioning as a kind of reflection on the events from which the group has turned away. Rembrandt's rough characterization of these ancillary figures create distance between them and his emphatic depiction of putative Simon, to whom art historians seem to have offered a name because of his distinction in the group. All in the group have turned away from Jesus, but the man whose regret has visible expression is exempted from the ugly exaggeration inflicted on the facial features of the others. It is a striking coincidence that the stuff with the sponge of vinegar, mentioned in Matthew, John, and Mark, held by a horseman, begins at the back of this figure's head. The linkage strongly suggesting itself through this planimetrical arrangement between the man's deeply gloomy, indeed bitter expression and the sponge of vinegar makes sense in that the hagiographic collection known as the Legenda Aurea speak of the bitterness of Jesus' suffering resulting from the turning away of his friends, as prophesied in the book of Job. My acquaintances, like strangers, have departed from me, my kinsmen have forsaken me. Rembrandt thus orients the movement of light from the cross in the picture foreground in two ways. On the one way, there is the group moving with heavy steps on the left, its progress impeded by a primeval rock formation along the picture's edge. On the other hand, there are the two fast-moving figures beneath the cross facing a cave-like abyss on the picture's right edge. With close scrutiny on the individual pictorial elements, we see how these two groups are built up in or balanced against one another in clear compositional arrangement. Meaningful interrelationships emerge forcefully. At the same time, our perception does not drift away through the depiction's manifold facets, for Rembrandt himself does not get lost in detail, but remains concise through his sketchiness. And when this is not the case, as in the merchant figure, he then exerts elaboration, drives it into the shadows, so that it necessarily calls less attention to itself, and the figure thus loses importance. In contrast to such darkened passages, which often move out into the immediate periphery, the hard strokes of line leap onto the reworking of adjunct figures, the sketchinet generating light. So in contrast to the dark passages, which often move out onto the immediate periphery, the hard strokes of lines leap onto the reworking of adjunct figures, their sketchiness, on the other hand, generating light. A comprehensive chiaroscuro absorbs the individual figures in this doubly and mutually contrary way. Rembrandt creates an all-pervasive mood whose different facets unfolds between the groups of figure. For Rembrandt, chiaroscuro was the central means for articulating an artistic purpose. According his colleague Joachim von Sandrart observed in his Deutsche Akademie that in his work Rembrandt let little light be seen except at the most significant location for his purpose, around which he maintained light and shadow artfully together, along with well-measured reflection, so that the light made its way into the shadow with great judgment, and in every was a high degree of reason. Hence, light and shadow are applied in a calculated manner in order to generate an effect that conveys meaning and produce clarity from darkness. The artist thus applies little light in order to especially steer the viewer's attention in spotlight fashion. The ill-defined mass enters into what Sandrart refers to as dark black, finsterschwarz, dissolving the contours of the individual figures and thus leveling them off. Rembrandt consequently uses chiaroscuro less to create a particular plausible context than to endow something specific with prominent meaning. In regard to the three crosses, chiaroscuro is the defining pictorial element that, as often been noted, evoked the decisive moment in the narrative of the Passion, as recounted in Luke. I cite, "And it was about the 6th hour that there was a darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. And the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was rent in the middle. And then Jesus had cried with a loud voice. He said, 'Father, into my hands I commend my spirit. Into your hands I commend my spirit.' And having said thus, he gave up the ghost. Now, when the centurion saw what was done, he glorified God, saying certain this was a righteous man. And all the people that came together to that side, beholding the things which were done, smoothed their breast and returned." In Rembrandt's etching, Luke's account is not only brought to life through the oppressive mood of night, along with the central event of the captain's insight and the turning away of the people. The artist's vehicle, in this respect, is above all the central beam of light, breaking into the chiaroscuro that endows the scene with volume and space, blanking it out and rending the veil of the temple. This supernatural light is severe and biased. The power of the light beams, materialized in black strokes, blackens the face of the thief on Jesus' right and extinguishes the thief on his left, brought through the intensity of its rays. While the lines making the light rays have been drawn with a straight edge, the shadow parties modeling space and bodies have been drawn freehandly. The cross-hatching, creating spatial depth, emerges clearly in the picture's upper left quarter, where rising parallel lines, curved in correspondence with Rembrandt's hand movement, are woven into a field made of falling lines. The field in itself heterogeneous, since the distinctly shorter lines form small subsidiary fields whose open border collide. Gaps and intersections form the vague contour of a cloud mass. A field composed of parallel lines falling vertically on the thief on the picture's left condenses the mass of clouds into a threatening scenario. There is likewise hand-drawn cross-hatching within the light beams itself, inscribing shadow areas with spatial incision around Jesus' lower body. A wedge of shadow has been inserted behind the brightly lit group around John, and spatially embeds it in order to give it more prominence. We can observe the same process in the figure of the right-hand thief, a field of cross-hatching that intensified the contour of his body, illuminates frontside, and underscores the illuminating effect. So these cross-hatching faces a similar field on the arm and back area, where here this field generates shadow. So we see it here comes similar lines, and here these lines work on something else. The softer line applied especially on the back and behind underscores, to the contrary, a body modeling function. These fields, which visibly work on the figure's visual emergence, create a texture that optically fuse figure and ground, since they generate zones of specific spatiality. The texture's graphic presence at the same time reveals the picture's structure of illusion, but the insightfulness of the etching not only emerges in the shadow area, but rather even more explicitly in those passages that are left incomplete and thus dissolve a figure in light. It is very likely that Samuel van Hoogstraten had this in mind when he made the following observation. And even as one recognizes his friend from far away or meets him by dim light, later seeing, comprehending his form with understanding, so a rough sketch often gives such a great impression to the knowledgeable that there is more to be seen in them than in more highly worked ones. As already mentioned in an exemplary way, the different versions of the three crosses illustrate Rembrandt's readiness to reconsider individual figures in detail, their features and scenic embedding. But in the fourth version of this etching, this revisionary process takes a dramatic turn, the entire scene being newly arranged and the personal largely exchanged by means of burning away parts incised in the copperplate. John now stands there isolated, his outstretched arms, in effect, whipping away the old couple at his side. And the group around Mary has likewise been newly configured, even her own form revisit. Her face sinks to the other side, her expression is hardly legible. This is better, maybe there's not so much ink on this print. Has she folded both hands together for prayer, or simply raised her right hand expressively, while her left hand, if we indeed identify the bright point of light as that, is placed before her stomach? Hope you can see. This is Mary, and maybe this is a hand or not. A woman on the left above her, with a heartscarf drawn down over her forehead, appears to be striking her right fist against her head in despair. A second woman on Mary's left side appears to be tending to her, while behind this woman, two older men have arrived and compassionately observe the scene. Behind them stand some people, forming a small dense crowd whose configuration, now caught in the net of shadowing, remains, in fact, unrecognizable. Heads rise from this darkness in schematic fashion, gaining contour without entering into the light. The new figure of a bearded man with a white hat on the picture's right edge appears like a shadow of himself. Here. It is impossible to say if the kneeling woman in front of Mary is still present in the scene. Her bonnet and shawl have been traced with form strokes, but in general her figure sinks into shadow. In the fourth version, the spatial distance that in the earlier version contrast of light and shadow had opened the spatial distance is now between her figure and those of the fleeing men in the foreground has been leveled away due to the shadow zone now taking over the once brightly lit middle area. Rembrandt has here reduced these men to only one figure on the picture's right. The boulder that formerly hit the right foot on one of the fleeting men has been removed. Rembrandt now offering a crude outline of the foot raised in the act of running. In distinction to the first two versions, in the third version, the fleeting man had already raised his robe. Here, in the fourth version, it is simply shortened and flutters dramatically towards the back. The turn of the figure's head now seems to shift indecisively between two possibilities, a side or frontal view. The fusion of profile and three-quarter view deforms a man's face. Not only has the man's companion been removed from the scene, but also gone are the women who threw themselves to the ground behind the two men. In the place, Rembrandt has menacingly erected two overlapping clods of earth that appear to recall the earthquake spoken of in the resurrection scene in Matthew. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, my God, why," crucifixion scene, my God, why had you forsaken me? Some of them, from them that stood there, when they heard that, said, this man called for Elias, and straightway one of them ran and took a sponge and filled it with vinegar and put it on the reed and gave it to drink. The rest said, let us see whether Eliah will come to save him. Jesus, when he had cried with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent. On the left side of the sheet, the reworking of the copper plate resembles a comprehensive and, in fact, in face of what was reckless new configuration. The old couple with covered eyes on the earliest picture left edge is replaced with a single old man who looks like a prophet, his wrong hand placed on the rock, looking ahead with melancholy, his back to the scene. If Rembrandt was thinking of a specific figure here, then Elia, the prophet Jesus invoked, comes to mind, seen by the people as the crucified Christ revenant. In Matthew, Jesus himself at one point refers to Elijah as his forerunner. But I say unto you that Elias is come already, and they knew him not, but have done unto him whatever they listed. Likewise shall also the Son of Man suffer of them. In any event, in the first days of the three crosses, the melancholy seeming figure of a prophet replaces the anxious old couple who covered up their eyes. At the same time, the prophet takes on the empathic role of putative Simon of Cyrene, who in the biblical narrative carries Jesus' cross to the crucifixion, thus sharing his suffering. If then this prophet figure standing on the left side of the picture, addressing the viewer and opening a view onto the event, actually represents Elia, a hypothesis for which there are no visual signs as a clear symbol reading, then this would underscore the event's fatality. In the new version, Rembrandt himself expands the historical moment with his depiction when he introduced a figure to the group of horsemen beneath the cross who is unmistakably the citation of an artwork from an earlier period. As Ludwig Münz has shown, the prominent figure of the rider whose presence conflicts with that of the centurion, the cantering of his horse being placed with decisive emphasis above the kneeling figure's back area, although he's spatially situated in the front. This man on horseback is taken from Pisanello's medal image of Gian Francesco Gonzaga. Münz ties the horse handler behind the rider to an etching from the compendium known as Speculum Romane Magnificentiae, which shows the famous colossal sculpture group of the Dioscuri on the Roman Quirinal. In the later case, however, only the contour of the rearing horse corresponds, whereas the handler in the three crosses is evidently having difficulty resisting the horse's stormy power. And this reversal of strengths perverts the antique reference, as Robert Baldwin has already noticed, writing, Rembrandt's horse retainer has nothing to do with the original Dioscuri theme. Rembrandt's horse play less on the theme of the heroic restraint than on panic in the face of Christ's death. By contrast, the position of the antique Dioscuri corresponds to the handler in the earlier version, where in the last version, his formerly empty facial surface is now endowed with a strained expression. What is so astounding as well as highly irritating in the fourth state is the import of a foreign body that was not cleverly transformed as usual to fit unconspicuously into Rembrandt's own version of the crucifixion. The rider, so high on his horse, seems lonely in the midst of the crowd. He is not only the sole figure here rendered in profile, but his striking tall, three-tiered head covering makes him stand out. The groom, who reins the rearing animal with difficulty, functions as a counter-image to this representative depiction of the commander who has firm control over his horse. The animal is standing securely on a section of earth that seems to be splitting and forming a crevice. Lightly leaning forward, the rider's upper body has a field of shadow next to it, deepening the gap between him and the rider standing guard beneath the cross, and contrasting his silhouette with the surrounding space. While in the earlier conception of the scene, the light fell on the mourners, now it strikes in muted fashion the figure of this enigmatic rider, his figure framed by the horse, handler, and guard beneath the cross. Both the light beam's illuminatory power is substantially weakened. Shadow now rules the picture's space. On its right edge, the parallel hatching folds down vertically, running into the row of lines delineating the light beam. Emerging here is a narrow meshed linear texture, hiding the thief on the right side like a heavy curtain. His position has been incisively altered in that the entire cross has been turned 45 degrees towards Jesus. We can only discern this position from the side view on the crossbeam and the thief's raised breasts, vaguely discernible in the shadowy edge. Rembrandt's reworking involves something akin to an excision of this figure. It is entirely possible that the artist was simply dissatisfied with the change of posture and therefore almost completely effaced the figure. But the change is also radical in theological sense, as it undermines the traditional opposition between the good and the bad thief as a stable framework for Jesus as universal judge. The prospect of salvation for one of the thieves manifest in the earlier versions, rays of light, is now left to the viewer's imagination. In a depiction focused on fatal tragedy and less on a moral message, the distinction between God and wicked, good and wicked, takes second place. Interestingly enough, Rembrandt's earlier decision to differentiate the thieves by dint of chiaroscuro created unclearness about their interpretation. Some scholars read the motive of being struck by an intense light as a form of punishment, other as a sign of salvation. The revision of the three crosses comes at the cost of visual decipherability. The parallel hatching takes the upper hand, shadowing becomes dominant, the conjuring rougher. It seems that the image itself is hidden behind a half-transparent veil woven of the graphic texture. The motif of the grotto is completely replaced by a field of parallel hatching that now lays out the path taken by the fleeing person. The once prominent figure of Mary Magdalena bending her head down to the Sopadaneum is pushed into shadow, a figure made unremarkable. The graphic texture comes to the surface and detects the figure's consistency. Rendered rough in this manner, the figures sink into the dark underground, itself emerging from the horizon of the uncertainty and becoming cognizable as something with a determining function. As Robert Baldwin has already suggested, a poem of Rembrandt's friend Jeremia de Decker, betitled Good Friday and published 1651 and 1656, may have provoked the radical changes that took place in the last state. It reads, "The cloudy mist, it is true, of human torment for time dulls the rays of his divinity. But if you were not blind through envy or lack of faith, you would see more shine forth from him than human frailty, even through the mist of torment. Looking at Rembrandt's courses, we must admit that in comparison with the first version, the rays of divinity are sparse. The mist overshadows the whole scene and endows the event with a ghostly presence. The people and their pain becomes unreachable even for our imagination. It seems that we, as beholders, are witnessing something mysterious, and in our attempt to figure out what it is, we experience a fundamental, troublesome blindness, a blindness that makes us part of the ignorance concerning Christ's unfathomable sacrifice. And this insight comes through the experience of a sacrifice on another level. The interweaving of figure and ground, visually graspable in the texture of the linear netting's shadowing that envelopes the entire picture, is the basis for Rembrandt's radical disengagement from the picture lying beneath. The strong presence of the alien rider underscores the process of disengagement, palpable as well in the rough rendition of the other figures. It is remarkable that Rembrandt has undertaken the radical revision of the individual figures on top of themselves rather than using a new plate. This procedure necessarily incorporates negation in the sense of excision of the underlying picture. The tragic quality, the mood of portended finality, which seems to rule the revision at its core, is in the end triggered through the laceration of the figures. Interestingly, the writer alone displays resistance to this process of disintegration. And indeed, the import of an alien figure already conceptually signifies a separation from the work's foundation. His contour effaces the presence of the former centurion whose kneeling position before the cross expressed his conversion. Further insight into the enigmatic, reserved figure, the witness of the divine nature of the crucified Christ in this scene, remains elusive. Thank you for your attention.